Buying a home is exciting, right? But signing a buyer representation agreement without understanding it completely, that could cost you big. In this video, I'm breaking down the key things that you must know before you put a pen to paper. From broker compensation to potential financial risks, I'll help you protect your wallet and your peace of mind. Stick with me, this is knowledge that every smart buyer needs. So why do we have to have this conversation in the first place? Well, things have changed, and specifically the law has changed. And so today, if you call up a buyer's agent and you ask them to show you 123 Main Street, they have to first enter into an agreement with you regarding their compensation before you ever set foot on the property. And this has to be done in writing, and typically it's going to be done through some type of form like this one. And here in California, this particular form is published by the California Association of Realtors. It's called the Buyer Representation and Broker Compensation Agreement. So we're going to use this form because it's pretty typical of forms that you'll find across the United States. This one is very comprehensive and details the things that you really ought to know before you enter into an agreement. This contract is divided up into paragraphs, the first one being paragraph A, representation. And there's two subparagraphs, the representation period and the type of representation. And so, like all contracts, this must have a beginning and an end date, and this one cannot exceed 3 months. So this is important to note, and I want to just say that before entering into one of these agreements, I think it's important that you go ahead and interview several agents. I really believe this is the best way to approach one of these forms because you want to have an understanding of that agent's qualifications. You want to get a feeling whether or not you can work with that person, and hopefully one that you can trust that person before you even get started. And so in lieu of that, though, you may consider making a very short term for an agreement. So this contract could be for just 1 day if you don't have that relationship set up already. So moving on, we go to the type of representation, and this is also very important. This says whether or not this contract is either non-exclusive or exclusive. And it points to paragraph 4B. So we're going to go back to 4B and read what it says. It says non-exclusive is compensation is payable only if there was broker involvement with the property. But exclusive representation, the broker is entitled to compensation if the buyer acquires property during the representation period or any extension with or without broker involvement, even if another broker is also entitled to be paid for representing the buyer. So it makes this provision very important and one that you really need to follow the terms of this agreement once it's been signed. And we'll talk more about that as we go through the document specifics. So the next portion is paragraph B, property to be acquired. And there's several subparagraphs, the property type, the location, and a place for additional description. For most buyers, this is probably not going to be important because it's made to specify just a particular geographic area or a type of property that the agreement is going to cover. And so it might become important if a buyer was to buy two different types of property, for instance, a commercial property and a residential property, and they were shopping at the same time. Or maybe in the case where they're shopping in two different locations. So in this case, maybe they're shopping in San Diego County, but they want to use a separate agent for shopping in Los Angeles County because they haven't pinned that down. So they could specify that this agreement is only good for a property in San Diego County, for instance, or it's only good for a commercial property. And so that might be very important, again, only if a potential buyer is seeking multiple properties. Otherwise, I think you can move on beyond this. So the next paragraph that we want to look at is paragraph D, properties excluded from representation. And there's a paragraph number that this one points to. It's paragraph 7. It's important to understand this. So this is an advisory regarding the buyer signing multiple buyer representation agreements. And it first says the buyer shall inform the broker in writing if the buyer has signed any other buyer representation agreements, whether exclusive or non-exclusive, with any other broker for any property described. 2, that the buyer shall disclose to the broker if another broker showed buyer such property virtually or in person, or wrote an offer on, or otherwise acted on the buyer's behalf. Such property, buyer may owe compensation to that broker if the buyer purchases such property. And 3, if the buyer has signed an exclusive buyer representation agreement with another broker that has not expired or been terminated, buyer may owe compensation to that broker if the buyer purchases such property, even if that broker has no involvement with the property. And 4, buyer shall disclose any property for which the buyer is obligated to pay another broker. And so again, it's very important to understand the provisions of this so that you don't get yourself in financial hot water. So let's talk about paragraph E, broker compensation. And this is where the biggest changes have taken place. So prior to August 17th and for years before that, it was customary for the seller to pay the buyer's agent's commission. And so the seller's agent and the seller would discuss this at the time the listing was taken, and they would make an agreement as to what a cooperating broker would get paid in the sale of their home. And that amount would be published in the multiple listing service. Well, that no longer takes place. And the line as to who pays the commission has really been blurred. And so as I talked about before, the reason for this form being signed is for the buyer and the buyer's agent to agree on a commission before they're ever shown a property. And so E1 talks about the amount of that compensation is expressed as a percentage, or it could be a flat fee, and it's set forth here. The second part, E2, payment received by broker from seller or others. So there's a provision here that says if the broker receives compensation from sellers or others for broker's representation of buyer, the amount shall be credited against the buyer's obligation to pay the broker. And so what they're saying there is that any money received from the seller will be credited to the amount that you agreed to in E1. Now there's a third provision here, E3, which talks about the continuation period shall be blank calendar days after the representation period or any extension. And so that's important to understand that you really want to go back to 4C and read all the provisions for this, but in essence it's saying that if you were under contract under the terms of this agreement and the buyer's agent showed you some properties and this agreement expired, those properties are still covered under that agreement for the time specified in E3 beyond the expiration of this contract. So that's also a place where you want to make sure that you understand what you're agreeing to before you agree to it. Next, there's paragraph F, cancellation rights and notice. And so obviously this is important to understand. Typically, you're not going to need to exercise this provision, but it's important that you understand it just in case things don't work out the same way that you hope they would. You want to make sure, again, that you're not having two of these agreements that are active at the same time, and familiarizing yourself with the terms of cancellation be important in case you need to. Next, we have paragraph G, buyer financial and personal information. So what they're asking for here would be your mortgage pre-approval letter, proof of funds, which would be your bank statements showing the amounts for your down payment, closing costs, your earnest money deposit, those type of things. And the contract provides for 5 days, but I'd suggest that you go ahead and compile that information before you ever enter into an agreement. The agent's going to need those not only to be able to write an offer for you, but to understand that he's working with a qualified buyer. So bring those in and get that ready as quickly as possible. Now there's some other financial considerations in G2, and they're important to note. So this first box says that the buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay the broker. And this very well may be the case. A lot of buyers won't be able to afford to pay the compensation without either a loan or help from the seller. And so it points to paragraph 9B. And so it says here that if this box is checked, that the buyer agrees to include a term in the buyer's offer requesting the seller to compensate the buyer's broker. And for a transaction, this agreement is contingent upon seller or others or both agreeing to pay broker the full amount that buyer is contractually obligated to pay the broker. So this is something that's really important to understand, obviously, and you want to consider carefully. And then lastly, I want to bring us back up to the amount of compensation in E1. So it's important to understand that the seller is not obligated to pay any amount greater than what the buyer is willing to pay. And so, as an example, if this was left blank, or maybe it was zeroed out, like the buyers are not willing to pay the buyer's agent anything, or maybe it's a very low amount, maybe they're only willing to pay 1% of the purchase price or something along that line. When they make an offer to the seller and ask the seller to pay the compensation, the seller is not responsible to pay any more than what you would pay. And so it's important information to understand, again, prior to entering into this agreement. Now that you know the ins and outs of the buyer representation agreement, you're one step closer to making confident and informed decisions on your home buying journey. If you have any questions or want to dive deeper, drop a comment below or just reach out. I'm always here to help. So don't forget to like and subscribe for more tips on navigating the real estate world, and I'll see you soon.